This is the Sean Lee neck piece with the pearls that Karen Elson wore in Voss.
Yes.
And I think, I don't know whether I can say this, but I think she fell wearing it.
She did. She tells.
You know the story.
Well, partly because I do a series of interviews.
You've worked with her.
Yeah. Well, on Show Studio, there's a series called Subjective, which is where I sit with models. So Karen Elson was one of them.
And did she tell you that story?
And we go through, their greatest photographs and they tell me the stories behind them. It's a great series. And one of the ones I went through, of course, I went through Lee's work with her, and we talked about Voss. And she said, yes. I said, because if you'd fallen in that, Karen, it would have been devastating. Well, I did fall.
She fell, and apparently I wasn't backstage. Lee never used to let me go backstage until one time, much later, because he used to say it spoilt the surprise.
Right.
There were very few people backstage, but the story was related to me like, you're never going to guess what happened. It was just part of the excitement because Karen's so amazing. She fell in this thing that could have. I mean, I think Lee flirted with danger hugely.
Yes.
And that's the clothes and the staging of the shows. Really bad things could have happened at any point, and that was part of it.
By the grace of God that they didn't, because the show I was involved in.
Health and safety, I don't think so.
No, not really. In Plato's, they were being followed by robots. The girls were being followed down a catwalk by those robots.
In those shoes.
In those shoes, with Guido's hair, which was 2 foot higher than we ever expected. And those robots were programmed beforehand. So those robots were going to go through that pattern at that speed, whatever happened on that catwalk.
Wow.
So it wasn't that we were sitting controlling the robots. The robots were pre-programmed to do that run. So we'd rehearsed it all. If one of those girls had taken a dodgy step, they'd have been whacked to the back of the head.
But also, do you know, because Sam told me that, and I think this happened a lot, that nobody could walk in those shoes.
Right.
And she was desperate, and she was saying to Lee, no one can walk in these shoes, we've got to do something really bad's going to happen.
Yeah.
And he said, they are going to walk in those shoes, we are going to have a man at each corner of the catwalk. If they fall, the man will pick. And of course, none of them fell.
No, they didn't.
And there was something about, and probably people are going to watch me saying this and you listening to this and think, are these people out of their minds? It's very difficult to understand the excitement that motivates people to take risks for fashion.
Yeah.
It wasn't for fashion, it was for Lee.
Yeah.
And Lee was fashion and beyond fashion, and people wanted to take risks for him. This is a very good example of something dangerous, and you've made it look dangerous.
Yeah. Well, it was an incredible piece of jewellery by Sean. I've increased its dangerous factor by actually piercing the breasts and the arms and the face of the girl with it.
Nice of you.
Exactly. As if it's growing through her in that sort of slight fairy tale sort of, Sleeping Beauty kind of.
Which Lee would have loved, I think.
Yeah. And it's a piece which Sean was when we're interviewing Sean for the part of the series. I was just such a great collaborator of Lee's. I'm a really
really close friend.
Yeah. I really sort of bought all of that sort of that thing that Lee wanted to have, that sort of fairy story, dangerous kind of thing.
Gothic.
Interesting on the Gothic side. I feel that's become slightly too dominant in the analysis. It sounds awfully cold. Slightly too dominant in the sort of, when we talk about Lee, we often talk about Gothic because it's there. But actually, he was a real modernist and futurist.
That's true. That's really true. And it's very difficult. I'm not sure that comes through very well in Savage Beauty, either at the Met or the V&A, just because of the setting and the formality of it. But absolutely, he was a modernist. He changed silhouette. He changed the way people dressed in a way that it's very difficult to think of other people. I mean, Ray, Helmut Lang.
Right.
But the whole Bumpster thing, which he did really early on, changed the way people dressed.
Yeah.
And he was a passionate modernist. I guess his sensibility, the dark romance is very Gothic.
Yeah.
And when he got involved with Givenchy and couture, he got quite wrapped up in that, didn't he? He got, the kind of petite main, the craftsmanship, and the kind of all these materials at his fingertips. But this period, the early London period, was really modern. It was about dresses made out of cling film, and it wasn't even really fairy tale at the beginning. It was hardcore, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's something that's slightly been for either just because curators have to come down on
Yeah.
one side or the other, or for reasons it's more palatable to go for that sort of, slightly sort of, romanticised version.
Well, I
of
think
the
that's
love of
when the
Victorian
fashion
past.
press certainly liked Lee.
Yeah.
Was when he did the softer, flowery.
Do you think? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Do you think that people on the whole like the past because it's safe, because it's happened, and they fear the future because it hasn't, and therefore it's more acceptable?
Yeah, I think there's definitely comfort in things that you recognise. Definitely. But with Lee, I think people liked his clothes when they weren't as savage, when they weren't as modern. And yes, that's because I guess it's easier to look at a woman covered in flowers, even if they are ripped up flowers, than it is to look at a woman covered in latex and thorns.
Yeah, but he loved latex.
But he loved latex, and he loved thorns, and he loved wood, and he loved, there was all kind of naivety to his approach that certainly at the beginning, and that stopped in a way because he had all the resources at his fingertips from a certain point. But at the beginning, he would have made anything out of anything. And the thing that's incredible about, say, those dresses in Highland Rape is that lace was cheap as chips. It was the roughest old nylon lace, but it really didn't look like it.
No.
And that takes quite a talent.
Yeah, but I think his sort of, when I first started perceived him, he was much more on a sort of harder, streeter, more kind of subversive. I mean, not like Ray Kakuba, but in that sort of.
No, but in
more
the
towards
anarchic,
that.
Changing, iconoclastic. I mean, it's an overused word, but smashing things up, changing things, driving things.
Yeah. There was very much that, and I think that's perhaps the most underexplored element that we've seen because of the Savage Beauty sort of revival of his work. I think that's the thing. Although Katie did a pretty good job, I think, with the London rooms in the V&A.
And it was very good to see them.
Yeah, because I think that's what people said. I can't remember who I was talking to the other day. So that actually, those are my favourite rooms of the whole show.
They're the clothes that I will always remember. And I think that, and those shows around that period, sort of 96 to 99, those London shows are the shows, at the end as well, the last maybe 2 years blew my mind completely. All of Lee blew my mind, but if I had to talk about periods, he had a really huge creative surge. Plato's Atlantis, The Horn of Plenty, that period. But this period, 96 to 99 in London, was, for me, it completely changed my life because I was privileged enough to work with him and the way I looked at things. And I remember taking my husband to the Shalom Harlow show, number 13, and him saying afterwards, I had no idea that a fashion show could be like that. No. And he's a complete outsider. I mean, not a complete outsider because he lived with me, obviously, but I think he always thought that what I did was a bit prissy and a bit fizzy. And he was completely blown away by it, as I think a lot of people. A lot of people loved Lee. When they saw Lee on the telly being interviewed, they'd say, Lee, he's such a great person, he's so real. Because the common assumption is that none of us are real. In fact, the people who Lee had around him I think we're quite real.
Well, reality moments.
We're here, but he was incredibly real and then incredibly imaginative and inspired. And that combination, like so many of the combinations in Lee, was really seductive.